is a villain? Someone who goes out of their way to be menacing. Someone who is bloody-minded and murderous. Someone who consciously implements dangerous and divisive policies. Someone who twirls his moustache and guffaws in a wing-back chair. What is a villain? A demon, perhaps, motivated by pure evil, born in the bowels of hell, or a horrifying psychopath made this way through an abusive, violent upbringing. What is a villain? Someone who knows what they're doing is evil, but does it anyway. But is it really that simple? What if our villain isn't cackling, plotting, and relishing in the misfortune they're causing? What if, horror of horrors, they believe that this evil thing they're doing, this evil way that they're behaving, is objectively the morally right thing to do? Now, there's a heck of a lot of debate surrounding this subject. Whether or not certain serial killers, mass murderers, perpetrators of the most violent crimes know what they're doing is wrong, or whether they're completely convinced that what they're doing is right. There's a heck of a lot of debate about what right and wrong actually are, what evil is, and how far we can be objective about morality. And hey, I'm not a moral philosophy professor, a psychoanalyst, or someone who claims unwavering certainty over the moral truths of the universe, so I'm not here to tell you what evil is or what to tick off on your "are they a villain" bingo card. But that idea, that a person can do something the majority of people say would deem abhorrent, evil perhaps, and genuinely think and believe down to their core that they're doing the morally right thing, that they're doing a service for the benefit of others even, is a fascinating one. And it's explored to devastating effect in The Possibility of Evil, a tremendous short story by everyone's favourite gothic queen, Shirley Jackson. If you're familiar with Jackson's work, chances are you know that she writes about all kinds of evil, from evil demons, to evil houses, to evil traditions passed down the generations in small American communities. But what about an evil that doesn't recognise itself? What about an evil that is blind to its own consequences? How does Shirley Jackson write as a protagonist who doesn't need to justify her own evil doing and villainy because, to her, it's not evil or villainous? And what can we learn from her about the way we think about moral authority? But before we get into all that, welcome. I'm Dr. Rosie Whitcombe. This is Mousy the Mutilator. She's actually not. Nowadays she's an indoor cat, and even when she was an outdoor cat, she never really hunted that much. And we make videos on words. Lots of gorgeous gothic words, so please subscribe if that's your jam. A stupendous thank you to our patrons over on Patreon. Thank you so much for supporting our channel, and if you'd like to join them, there's a link in the description. As you might have guessed, this video deals in some dark themes, like anonymous harassment and manipulation, so be aware of that as we proceed into the emotional minefield that is Jackson's writing to answer the big questions. Namely, how does Shirley Jackson flip the script on evil and redefine villainhood? But first, a brief psychological interlude. How many times have you heard an act of violence referred to as senseless? What about depraved or immoral? I feel like we hear these things a lot. I can hear the voices of newscasters and politicians saying things like, "We cannot condone these senseless acts of violence," or "These immoral acts must be stopped." Calling something senseless or depraved or immoral helps us to make sense of it in our own heads, helps us to compartmentalise traumatic things like horrendous acts of violence. The perpetrator has no sense. They are depraved. They are evil. They are beyond the bounds of society's moral code. They are not a moral person. They are immoral. They are not one of us. Their morality is broken. But what if their actions aren't the result of a breakdown of morality, and instead are the direct result of their morality? What if they actually have a strong sense of their own stance and a strict moral code that they carefully observe? That's what Alan Page Fisk and Tage Rye argue in their book Virtuous Violence. Here's Rye on the subject.
They feel that that violence is morally obligatory, and they feel that they'll be praised by their social group for doing so. And when you look at violent practices across the world, and we're looking at every kind of violent context we can find, so war, homicide, genocide, sexual assault, corporal punishment, dueling, sacrifice, and anything that we could find, what you find is that across all of these kinds of contexts, most perpetrators are claiming that their actions are motivated by moral sentiments. They hurt others because they feel like it's the right thing to do. They feel like they have to do it, and they feel as if that violence is virtuous.
This is super interesting to me. This idea that violence doesn't issue from the absence of morality, but from the strong and uncompromising presence of it. This puts the concept of evil into perspective and throws up some of the potential risks involved in deciding what is or is not evil. To deem a violent act senseless, chaotic, depraved, evil, beyond the realms of morality or understanding, limits our understanding of why the perpetrator did the thing to begin with. As David Nussbaum and Seamus A. Power argue, we don't need to approve of someone's moral framework to understand that it exists and guides their behaviour. And that understanding can bring us insights into the psychology of violence that we miss if we simply dismiss it as evil. Oh, come on, I hear you retort. It's not that complicated. Some things are just plain evil. The word means something. It has a dictionary definition, for goodness sake. And yes, it does. According to the OED, evil is the antithesis of good, in all its principal senses. In Old English, as in all the other early Germanic languages except Scandinavian, this word is the most comprehensive adjectival expression of disapproval, dislike, or disparagement. Evil is used to refer to things or people which are morally depraved, bad, wicked, vicious, hurtful, mischievous, prejudicial, malicious or slanderous, unpleasant, offensive, disagreeable, troublesome, painful, the list goes on, literally. There's some variation, and it has certainly changed over time and across different cultures, but generally speaking, what we can deduce here is that evil means bad, negative, the antithesis of good. But what actually constitutes an evil act is another story entirely. We know, objectively, what the word means, but the rest is subjective. What is evil to one person isn't necessarily evil to another. Just a quick side note, the word evil might have a relatively straightforward etymology, but this is not the case for the word villain. Today, a villain is oft considered an evildoer of some kind, right? But back in the day, a villain was originally a low-born, base-minded rustic, a man of ignoble ideas or instincts. It's only in later use that a villain became an unprincipled or depraved scoundrel, a man naturally disposed to base or criminal actions or deeply involved in the commission of disgraceful crimes. Originally a low-born, base-minded rustic. Wow. Make of that extremely classist and ableist etymological transformation what you will. But back to evil. If evil is subjective, if the perpetration of evil actions can be the result of a person or group's moral fortitude rather than their lack of morals, where the hell does that leave us? Fortunately, Mother Jackson has some answers. Shirley Jackson's 1965 short story, The Possibility of Evil, is perhaps a little undersung. When I think of Jackson, it's her novels that spring to mind, and certainly some of the dark tales collected in The Lottery and other stories. This story falls through the cracks somewhat, but it shouldn't. It's a devious piece of storytelling, rife with Jackson's trademark tension, but with one crucial difference. If you've watched any of these videos, you'll know that most of the stories I discuss, The Lottery, The Witch, The Renegade, of course, and The Demon Lover, feature protagonists who are, to all intents and purposes, victims of a malevolent something or other. In The Lottery, that malevolent something is tradition. Mrs. Hutchinson is stoned by her community as part of an ages-old ritual. In The Witch, the mother is traumatised by the bizarre rapport between her young son and a strange man who hit it off over a lively back and forth about decapitation and infanticide. In The Renegade, Mrs. Walpole is menaced by her neighbours and her bloody-minded children, and in both Of Course and The Demon Lover, the protagonists are threatened by the suggestion of the devil himself in the form of James Harris, the archetype of whom I explore in detail in this video. But in The Possibility of Evil, you could make a very strong case that the protagonist, Miss Adela Strangeworth, is not a victim. And you could make a very, very strong case that, even though she might not recognise it as such, she is, in fact, the antagonist of the story, the villain, dare I say. So, who is Miss Strangeworth? How do we figure her as a potentially malevolent protagonist? Just how evil does she get? Miss Adela Strangeworth stepped daintily along Main Street on her way to the grocery. The sun was shining, the air was fresh and clear after the night's heavy rain, and everything in Miss Strangeworth's little town looked washed and bright. Miss Strangeworth took deep breaths and thought that there was nothing in the world like a fragrant summer day. Not especially evil thus far. She's not cackling, she's not twirling her moustache, she's not butchering her neighbours. She's dainty. She's on her way to the grocer's. She's enjoying a bright, sunny day and the sweet smells of summer. Now, usually when I go to analyse the opening of one of Jackson's stories, I end up saying something like, everything seems lovely and peaceful, but this scene is actually rife with tension, and go from there. But this isn't the case here. Things are actually pretty relaxed. As I read it, there is but a single clue in Jackson's opening to the possibility of evil that hints at what's to come. Miss Strangeworth refers to the beautiful, sunny little town as hers. But this, on its own, isn't particularly menacing. It's pretty regular to refer to the place you live as my street, or my town, or my country, without implying that you are the ruler of the place. Miss Strangeworth carries none of the hallmarks of a storybook villain. And, as we get to know her, we realise she's less villain, more elderly mother-knows-best curtain twitcher. She's overfamiliar with her neighbours, and very proud of her long standing in the town. She knew everyone in town, of course. She was fond of telling strangers, tourists who sometimes passed through the town and stopped to admire Miss Strangeworth's roses, that she had never spent more than a day outside this town in all her long life. She was 71, Miss Strangeworth told the tourists, with a pretty little dimple showing by her lip, and she sometimes found herself thinking that the town belonged to her. My grandfather built the first house on Pleasant Street, she would say, opening her blue eyes wide with the wonder of it. This house, right here. My family has lived here for better than 100 years. My grandmother planted these roses, and my mother tended them, just as I do. They wanted to put up a statue of Ethan Allen. Miss Strangeworth would frown a little and sound stern, but it should have been a statue of my grandfather. There wouldn't have been a town here at all if it hadn't been for my grandfather and the lumber mill. Her pride in her home, in her town, in the very soil on which it was all built up thanks to her grandfather, and in which her precious roses have bloomed generation after generation, is more than just a little bit evident in this passage. I feel like I know people like Miss Strangeworth, people who are prideful and overbearing, which is annoying, but it also means they're very invested in the community and their heart is in the right place. It's frustrating, but also a little endearing. Or do you just find that kind of thing outright frustrating? Do let me know what you think in the comments below. Either way, one noteworthy feature of all this, in my estimation, is that Miss Strangeworth's overbearing pride doesn't seem to be a performance. My grandfather built the first house on Pleasant Street, she would say, opening her blue eyes wide with the wonder of it. This wonder feels real to me. She's not just saying it. She's genuinely in awe of her lineage, her family, her place in the town every time she recounts the story to strangers. She is fully immersed in overflowing and genuine familial pride. So, she's a bit grating, but she's hardly evil. All is well as we follow Miss Strangeworth around the town as she potters about and runs errands. And what might jump out at you here if you've read these stories is that unlike pretty much every other protagonist in Jackson's fiction, her neighbours are happy to see her. We've finally found a Jackson story where the protagonist isn't surrounded by menacing creeps. Miss Strangeworth had to stop every minute or so to say good morning to someone or to ask after someone's health. When she came into the grocery, half a dozen people turned away from the shelves and the counters to wave at her or call out, "Good morning." Oh, how nice, how wholesome. And really, it's no wonder she's so beloved within her community. She cares. We can see how much she cares when she inquires after Mrs. Harper in the grocer's. "Ran out of sugar for my cake frosting," Mrs. Harper explained. Her hand shook slightly as she opened her pocketbook. Miss Strangeworth wondered, glancing at her quickly, if she had been taking proper care of herself. Martha Harper was not as young as she used to be, Miss Strangeworth thought. She probably could use a good, strong tonic. "Martha," she said, "you don't look well." "I'm perfectly all right," Mrs. Harper said shortly. She handed her money to Mr. Lewis, took her change and her sugar, and went out without speaking again. Looking after her, Miss Strangeworth shook her head slightly. Martha definitely did not look well. Okay, yeah, she's overstepping it a bit, airing her unsolicited concerns about her neighbour in the middle of the grocery, but hey, the point is that she is concerned. She cares. She certainly cares about Don and Helen Crane and their new baby. Carrying her little bag of groceries, Miss Strangeworth came out of the store into the bright sunlight and stopped to smile down on the Crane baby. Don and Helen Crane were really the two most infatuated young parents she had ever known, she thought indulgently, looking at the delicately embroidered baby cap and the lace-edged carriage cover. "That little girl is going to grow up expecting luxury all her life," she said to Helen Crane. Helen laughed. "Oh, that's the way we want her to feel," she said. "Like a princess." "A princess can be a lot of trouble sometimes," Miss Strangeworth said dryly. "How old is Her Highness now?" 6 months next Tuesday, Helen Crane said, looking down with rapt wonder at her child. "I've been worrying, though, about her. Don't you think she ought to move around more? Try to sit up, for instance?" "For plain and fancy worrying," Miss Strangeworth said, amused. "Give me a new mother every time." "She just seems slow," Helen Crane said. "Nonsense. All babies are different. Some of them develop much more quickly than others. Miss Strangeworth is the senior party here. She's probably seen countless babies grow up. She's tired of all this new age nonsense about parenting philosophy. She doesn't want to see this poor baby grow up to be spoiled, and she doesn't want her parents worrying over her unnecessarily. Yes, she's overstepping again, but she's doing it out of love. She's offering them her decades of wisdom. Say it with me now. She cares." As Miss Strangeworth meanders home, making her judgy assumptions about the people she passes or interacts with, what we get is the strong and uncompromising sense that she knows best. She can see what others can't. Many people seemed disturbed recently, Miss Strangeworth thought. Now, is this blinkered superiority a good attitude to cultivate? No. But is it evil? No. Again, it's coming from a caring place, from a good place. She's just particular. She just likes things to be in order, and nowhere more so than in her own home, her pride and joy. From halfway down the block, Miss Strangeworth could catch the heavy accent of her roses, and she moved a little more quickly. The perfume of roses meant home, and home meant Strangeworth House on Pleasant Street. Miss Strangeworth stopped at her own front gate, as she always did, and looked with deep pleasure at her house, with the red and pink and white roses massed along the narrow lawn, and the rambler going up along the porch, and the neat, the unbelievably trim lines of the house itself, with its slimness and its washed white look. Every window sparkled, every curtain hung stiff and straight, and even the stones of the front walk were swept and clear. People around town wondered how old Miss Strangeworth managed to keep the house looking the way it did, and there was a legend about a tourist once mistaking it for the local museum and going all through the place without finding out about his mistake. But the town was proud of Miss Strangeworth and her roses and her house. They had all grown together. This is a beautiful, heady, overwhelming scene. The heavy scent, the deep pleasure, the richness and brightness of the colours of the flowers, the house, the lawn. It's so good, so perfect, so powerful. It's so gorgeous it lures people in. It's a fly trap. It's the stuff of legend. No wonder Miss Strangeworth is proud, and this pride is shared by her community. It's almost as if, with her good deeds, her sincere concern over their well-being, and her long-standing status in the town, she's their princess. Not ruling them, per se, but providing them with a figurehead, with someone they can look up to and feel inspired by. Miss Strangeworth, by her orderliness, her concern, and the immense value she brings to the community, is for the people. She guides them away from the possibility of evil, should it ever lurk in their presence. So, she arrives home, puts away her groceries, mulls over the option of brewing a cup of tea, and decides it's a good time on this lovely, sunny, bright, rose-filled afternoon to catch up on her correspondence. Although Miss Strangeworth's desk held a trimmed quill pen, which had belonged to her grandfather, and a gold frost fountain pen, which had belonged to her father, Miss Strangeworth always used a dull stub of pencil when she wrote her letters, and she printed them in a childish block print. After thinking for a minute, although she had been phrasing the letter in the back of her mind all the way home, she wrote on a pink sheet, "Didn't you ever see an idiot child before? Some people just shouldn't have children, should they?" She was pleased with the letter. She was fond of doing things exactly right. When she made a mistake, as she sometimes did, or when the letters were not spaced nicely on the page, she had to take the discarded page to the kitchen stove and burn it at once. Miss Strangeworth never delayed when things had to be done. After thinking for a minute, she decided that she would like to write another letter, perhaps to go to Mrs. Harper to follow up the one she had already mailed. She selected a green sheet this time and wrote quickly. Have you found out yet what they were all laughing about after you left the bridge club on Thursday? Or is the wife really always the last one to know?
Oh, okay, right, well, yeah, well, it's not great, is it?
So it's at this point in the story we get the reveal we've been waiting for. I mean, it's Shirley Jackson. It was always going to get dark. And what is revealed to us is that Miss Strangeworth writes anonymous hate mail to her neighbours. And I just need to pause here to draw your attention to a real-life, currently unsolved hate mail mystery of the same nature ongoing in the small village of Shiptonthorpe, North Yorkshire, of all places. People are out here literally receiving horrible, menacing letters from a mysterious someone who's turning this once quiet community into a village of poison. I mean, yikes. But back to Strangeworth. We suddenly see a side to her that takes her from irritating yet endearing town matriarch to vicious pre-internet cyberbully. As Hayley Phelan writes, Jackson is particularly prescient in this story. What Miss Strangeworth does with a stub of pencil and sheets of coloured paper is what hundreds of thousands of perfectly nice people do on the internet today. It's wonderfully dealt, this blow. The scene is so glorious, so serene, so precise, and then we get this all-caps childish scrawl of vitriol, and another, and we learn that this has been going on for a long time. Miss Strangeworth, who intoxicates people with her roses and offers guidance to her neighbours, is actually sat at home exposing their secrets, insulting them and driving their paranoia, and doing so in a way that is thought through and meticulous. She takes care over this. There is one way to do it, and she won't suffer mistakes. This reveal throws all Miss Strangeworth's previous encounters into question. When she comments on Mrs. Harper's health in the middle of the grocer's, for example, she's met with, "I'm perfectly all right," Mrs. Harper said shortly. She handed her money to Mr. Lewis, took her change and her sugar, and went out without speaking again. There's something about the sharpness of Mrs. Harper's tone and the way she hurries out of the shop that could suggest she's been on the receiving end of Miss Strangeworth's rather public scrutiny before, and she doesn't like it. And just before this encounter, when Miss Strangeworth orders a box of strawberries from the grocer, Mr. Lewis, we get this very subtle interaction that is never expanded upon. "I shall have a box," Miss Strangeworth said. Mr. Lewis looked worried, she thought, and for a minute she hesitated, but then she decided that surely he could not be worried over the strawberries. He looked very tired indeed. Initially, we might read this as another example of concern for members of her community, but knowing what we know about her menacing letter-writing habits, Mr. Lewis's worry might indicate something deeper. Does he suspect her of something, though he doesn't know what? Does he fear her in some way, perhaps? And we get another hint that Miss Strangeworth is a figure of fear in her community later in the story, as she heads up to bed for a much-needed snooze. After all, writing nasty letters to your neighbours really can take it out of you. No one in town would dare to disturb Miss Strangeworth during her afternoon nap. She slept, deep in the rich smell of roses. She has an alarming authority over her neighbours, it would seem. So maybe this idea that Miss Strangeworth offers up to us, that the town loves her, that they're proud of her, that they look up to her, isn't the case after all. For us, as readers, the illusion begins to dissipate. With the gift of hindsight, we see that those lines at the start of the story, Miss Strangeworth's little town looked washed and bright. She knew everyone in town, of course. She sometimes found herself thinking that the town belonged to her, all become sinister. These are no longer throwaway comments. They're indicators of her need to control, to enforce her sense of order, not just within the confines of her immaculate house, but over the town itself. From a well-meaning elderly woman to a narcissistic tyrant, Miss Strangeworth's evil is revealed to us. And this is super interesting when we think of this whole shebang in the context of virtuous violence, and the fact that central to Fisk and Rye's thinking is their understanding that morality is fundamentally about maintaining the prevailing social order. Frequently, that entails prohibiting violence, but at other times, it actually requires it. This is what we get in the possibility of evil. Miss Strangeworth is enacting a form of violence on her neighbours to maintain the prevailing social order, one that places her on the top of the pile. And crucially, she feels it is required of her. It is her duty to maintain this order, the one in which she, the last Strangeworth of Pleasant Street, is in control of her community. And it's through this lens that I think the story gets really interesting. Miss Strangeworth, like a true narcissist, doesn't believe that what she is doing is wrong. Even as she writes these vile letters, she believes she is doing her neighbours a service. Miss Strangeworth never concerned herself with facts. Her letters all dealt with the more negotiable stuff of suspicion. Mr. Lewis would never have imagined for a minute that his grandson might be lifting petty cash from the store register if he had not had one of Miss Strangeworth's letters. Miss Chandler, the librarian, and Linda Stewart's parents would have gone unsuspectingly ahead with their lives, never aware of possible evil lurking nearby if Miss Strangeworth had not sent letters to open their eyes. Miss Strangeworth would have been genuinely shocked if there had been anything between Linda Stewart and the Harris boy, but as long as evil existed unchecked in the world, it was Miss Strangeworth's duty to keep her town alert to it. It was far more sensible for Miss Chandler to wonder what Mr. Shelley's first wife had really died of than to take a chance on not knowing. There were so many wicked people in the world, and only one Strangeworth left in town. There is so much to this paragraph. It's so damn good. Firstly, we learn that Miss Strangeworth is consciously spreading rumours and not facts. Now, many people would consider this a bad thing, but Miss Strangeworth is not many people. She is the shepherd, the vigilante, making sure people know what they need to know, even if there's no proof, just in case. Do whatever it takes to keep evil at bay. There's also some dark stuff here with Miss Chandler and Linda Stewart's parents. What precisely did she need to open their eyes to? It's also hinted to us that Mr. Shelley's first wife died in an unsavoury manner. Was a murder covered up, perhaps? Is she therefore sparing Miss Chandler a similar fate, just as she spares Mr. Lewis from being robbed by his own grandson? She is the last Strangeworth, and as long as evil existed unchecked in the world, it was Miss Strangeworth's duty to keep her town alert to it. But of course, all this is based on her own personal suspicions, and, as we've established, her perception of things is unreliable. All this judgment, all these assumptions, are part of the illusion Miss Strangeworth lives within and cannot see beyond. Now at this point, you might be wondering, what's up with her worldview? Why does she live within this illusion? And it's hard not to speculate. Perhaps it has something to do with her sense of family pride and duty to the town her ancestors built. She wants to feel like she's contributing, doing something good too. Perhaps she's also lonely. She is the last of the Strangeworths after all. Her long and instrumental lineage is ending with her. Perhaps it's an inherited thing, a learned behaviour from her parents and grandparents. I'd be interested to know what you think, so please let me know down below. We don't get a clear answer to these questions as the story hurtles to its conclusion, but I've got to say, based on what Jackson tells us, I don't actually think she's struggling deep down, isolated and lonely, trying hard to live up to her grand ideals about her family. I think she is truly and completely self-confident and self-assured. Just look at this from near the story's conclusion. So, for context, she's walking past a group of children on the way to post her hate mail. Miss Strangeworth had never had any self-consciousness before the children. She did not feel that any of them were staring at her unduly or longing to laugh at her. It would have been most reprehensible for their parents to permit their children to mock Miss Strangeworth of Pleasant Street. The way this is framed implies the children are sort of laughing and pointing at her, but she does not see it. Again, she is fully under the influence of her own perception of the town and its people. She sees only what she wants to see, and she's not suffering because of it. Her self-grandeur benefits her, allows her to saunter unflinchingly in the face of people who might mock or insult her. She is 100% sure of herself, and this, I would argue, is a dangerous thing to be. Like, okay, it's great to be self-confident and happy in yourself, of course, but when that teeters over into thinking you're better than everyone else and that you know best, we've got some problems. Problems like the fact that, for Miss Strangeworth, writing these letters is absolutely the morally right thing to do. There's just no question. For her, the evil is out there, and she is preventing it from spreading. However, her fellow townspeople, should they find out who is behind these anonymous letters, scrawled in childish capitals on colourful paper, would likely not feel the same way. And, as it happens, today is the day Miss Strangeworth's secret is about to be exposed.
She slipped her letters into the slot, and 2 of them fell inside. The third caught on the edge and fell outside onto the ground at Miss Strangeworth's feet. She did not notice it, because she was wondering whether a letter to the Harris boy's father might not be of some service in wiping out this potential badness. Wearily, Miss Strangeworth turned to go home to her quiet bed in her lovely house, and never heard the Harris boy calling to her to say that she had dropped something.
And so things unravel. The Harris boy, and yes, for those of you who have watched this video, you'll understand the significance of the name Harris to Jackson's writing and the evil he represents, delivers this letter, tells the recipient who it's from, and Miss Strangeworth's identity as a pre-internet cyberbully is revealed.
Miss Strangeworth awakened the next morning with a feeling of intense happiness, and for a minute wondered why, and then remembered that this morning 3 people would open her letters. Harsh, perhaps, at first, but wickedness was never easily banished, and a clean heart was a scoured heart. She washed her soft old face and brushed her teeth, still sound in spite of her 71 years, and dressed herself carefully in her sweet, soft clothes and buttoned shoes. Then, going downstairs, reflecting that perhaps a little waffle would be agreeable for breakfast in the sunny dining room, she found the mail on the hall floor and bent to pick it up. A bill, the morning paper, a letter in a green envelope that looked oddly familiar. Miss Strangeworth stood perfectly still for a minute, looking down at the green envelope with the pencilled printing, and thought, "It looks like one of my letters. Was one of my letters sent back? No, because no one would know where to send it. How did this get here?" Miss Strangeworth was a Strangeworth of Pleasant Street. Her hand did not shake as she opened the envelope and unfolded the sheet of green paper inside. She began to cry silently for the wickedness of the world when she read the words, "Look out at what used to be your roses."
What an ending. Perfectly done, I think. We don't get to see how she reacts. We're just left in this moment of devastation and tension. This is, after all, before she's even seen what we can only assume is a bloody garden massacre. And what I think I find most impactful about the way this story ends is that we don't see Miss Strangeworth reforming in any way. Now, Hayley Phelan has this great analogy for reading Jackson. She says that there is an old parable about a frog being boiled to death. It holds that a frog put in boiling water will jump out immediately, but a frog placed in water that is gradually heated won't notice the change until he's boiled alive. That's what reading Jackson is like. The reader, like many of her characters, isn't fully aware of the evil until it subsumes them, and then it is too late. This feels totally relatable to me as a reader of Jackson, but, and I don't know about you, but I don't think it's quite the right analogy when it comes to Strangeworth herself. This idea that Jackson's characters aren't fully aware of the evil until it subsumes them implies that, despite an initial naivety, by the end of the story they gain a full awareness of what's going on. Strangeworth is subsumed by evil at the end of the story, but is she fully aware? What I mean is, does she have any sense that this evil has come about as a direct result of her actions? I don't think so. This ending gives us many things, but what it doesn't give us is Miss Strangeworth in a moment of realisation or remorse or guilt. To her, this is a reaffirmation of her identity. She's not a villain, but a Strangeworth of Pleasant Street, and she cries for what she perceives as the wickedness of the world and what it has done to her. Despite knowing what's happened and why, she remains oblivious to her own capacity for evil, her own responsibility in the matter. It's also a brilliant ending because it throws into disarray the question of victimhood. You could make the case here that Miss Strangeworth becomes a victim of sorts, and it's weird because it's not that I sympathise with her, but equally I'm not like, yes, good, they got their revenge. It all just feels bad, like things can only take a dark turn from here. What that turn will be, it's impossible to know, but Miss Strangeworth, I'd wager, isn't about to realise the error of her ways. Things will only get worse. She may well double down in her crusade to protect the town from evil. After all, the town where she lived had to be kept clean and sweet, but people everywhere were lustful and evil and degraded and needed to be watched. The world was so large, and there was only one Strangeworth left in it. This act of revenge against her will probably only confirm her belief that she's the only morally decent person in the town and everyone else is evil. And there are plenty of real life people out here, doubling down on their nonsense, burrowing so far into their own bias that they end up falling over the edge and becoming just plain ridiculous. The illusion only becomes more potent. It's in this way that Jackson gives us an astounding twist on villainy and the concept of evil. Miss Strangeworth, the narcissistic tyrant, only sees herself as the hero and then the victim. The evil lurks within everyone else. This idea that people everywhere were lustful and evil and degraded and needed to be watched reminds me of attitudes prevalent in early modern witch hunters or Christian missionaries looking to convert those they deemed uncivilized, or any number of more recent situations in which one person or group claims moral authority and decides what is best for everyone else. And this story also makes me wonder, is the villain who knows they're doing evil more likely to reform? It's not an uncommon trope, right, for a character to be vile but then at the 11th hour to do something good that reprieves them, redeems them. To make that change, surely they must recognise that they've been doing wrong. But if you never realise you've been doing wrong, if you've got your rose-tinted glasses firmly embedded in your nose bridge, if you are oblivious to the pain you cause, you can't make a conscious change. You'll sit in your perfect house, surrounded by your perfect garden, leading your valiant crusade, calm in your own certainty, your own righteousness, breathing in the deep perfume of your roses and your own absolutist moral authority. I hope you've enjoyed this rosy analysis of Shirley Jackson's The Possibility of Evil, and I would love to know your thoughts. Do you have a completely different interpretation of the story? Are you evil? Do you hold universal moral authority over your friends and neighbours? Do let me know in the comments below. Love learning about villains and how they spread their malcontent? Watch our video on Trump, Shakespeare and populism by clicking here next.